Hello, Nova Church house leaders. This is our third and final video preparing us for our Women's Roles workshop that we're doing on Saturday. And today we're going to be talking about two different approaches to biblical interpretation and the three main positions regarding women's role in serving in the church. So let's get into it. Our first stop is talking about biblical interpretation. The Bible always has to be interpreted, no matter what it is. Every bit of scripture, we have to understand it within its historical context, its literary, genre, social, cultural, all of that context. We always have to interpret the Bible. And there are so many books and textbooks and thousands of pages about biblical interpretation that we don't have anywhere near enough time to get into. We're going to talk about right now is two basic approaches that tend to define how the Restoration movement, like our church, has tended to read Scripture. John Mark Hicks, a traditional Church of Christ scholar, calls one of them the blueprint pattern that we look for to interpret, and the other the narrative pattern that we look for to interpret the Scripture. The blueprint pattern is probably the simplest and most common, which is I'm looking to the Bible to give me a blueprint of how to build my life and how to build the church. Tell me what to do, and I'm going to do it. Give me the example, and I'm going to do it. And if there's anything that's in Scripture that says I can or can't, or if there's an example of it, I'm going to do it. If there's no example, maybe I won't. It is this incredibly high view of Scripture that is just tell me what to do. And there's something incredibly noble about that. And that is how, we want to build most of our lives. It's what Jesus says, that if you build your house, on the rock that is my word, when the storms come, you're going to be okay. We want to build our lives and the church on the rock of Scripture. Give me the blueprint. Just tell me the blueprint. Now, the only challenge with that, or one of the challenges, is that sometimes those blueprints, those examples that we find in Scripture tell us what happened, but they don't necessarily tell us that it always needs to happen. For example, they chose the next apostle in Acts chapter 1 with casting lots. That's what they did. Is that how we're supposed to pick leaders? To write their names on a dice and roll it and see whose name comes out? Paul gives instruction to Timothy of bring my cloak with you. Are we all supposed to bring cloaks that we've left at different places? Is that how we're supposed to bring cloaks to church or when we travel? Or maybe most uncomfortably, greet one another with the holy kiss. Yeah, that happened. I don't know if that's something that we need to do here and now. Our blueprint gives us possibly an interpretation, but the other side of that, in response to that, is maybe there are some examples that were appropriate then, but maybe not so much now. And so what develops was something called the narrative, looking for a narrative pattern. It's very simple, which is where you're looking through the entire narrative of the story of God, from creation to the fall, to Old Covenant, to New Covenant, waiting for Jesus to come back, and seeing how God has played things out and how the character of God, the nature of God, the story of him and his people, the story of redemption has unfurled over the last several millennia. And what we can see is we can see the commands and the examples and maybe the blueprint data points within the larger context of the narrative of God, the entire thing there. Now, there's something beautiful about that because, we do know that God, we continually learn to understand more and more about God's character. We're never done having him reveal more things to us. So our view of Scripture and how to put things in tends to change with us as we mature in our faith. And when you saw things when you were younger, you tend to see things differently when you get older and more experienced. When I had no kids and no wife, I looked at things very differently than now, where I have a daughter, a wife, and one on the way. And so the idea there is that, maybe we can understand some of these commands maybe a bit easier to what is at the heart? What has God been trying to do the whole time rather than just here? Neither one of them of these two approaches, blueprint or narrative, has the monopoly on truth or has the monopoly on being the right way. They both need each other. And in fact, seeing each other, seeing the need for each other is absolutely necessary. If you have a blueprint without the narrative, you might lose the heart of those data points. If you have the narrative without the blueprint, you might tend to read your narrative into Scripture rather than reading God's narrative. The reason we're going over these two different approaches to Scripture is that these two approaches inform how the different positions that tend to be taken up as we're discussing women's role in the church. There are three main common ways that women's roles have been seen within the church. The first one would be no leadership within the church assembly. Second would be limited leadership or participation in the church assembly. And the third would be full leadership / participation in the worship service with the whole assembly. The first one, no leadership, no participation. This is very much a blueprint way of looking at the Scripture, particularly looking at two passages, one in 1 Corinthians 14, where it says women should remain silent in the churches. Very simple. Hard to get clearer than that. But if you wanted to, you could go over to 1 Timothy chapter 2, where it says, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. So if you look at Scripture from a very, very looking for the blueprint model, you're going to look at that and say, regardless of my personal feelings, these are two data points that are very, very clear. And there's not a third one to go like, well, those other two are wrong to bring into a conversation. You're just like, you look at those two things. And that would argue that women, while they can, and by the way, most proponents of this, no participation, even within the traditional churches of Christ, maintain this is only for a public church setting, that it's okay for women to speak in private settings, although many believe that the thing is not public or private, but if it's mixed company. Of course, women can teach women, that's in the Scripture, but this in question is a public mixed company worship setting. So that would be no participation. The second would be limited participation. Limited participation would be somebody who takes a look at the Scripture and sees that the idea of women must stay silent in the churches in 1 Corinthians 14 also has to be understood within the context of 1 Corinthians 11, where it does say a woman who prays or prophesied with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Meaning that for that person seeing that, okay, there must be some sense of silence, but it can't be prayer and prophecy since you had to do that in the first place. But the idea of where is the line? The limited participation. At some point, there is some limit on women, particularly if you do see it within the context and the lens of 1 Timothy 2, where it says, I don't permit a woman to teach or exercise authority. That, okay, so women can't speak or teach or exercise authority. How are we going to apply that? And there's a large spectrum of what that looks like and how that's applied in traditional Church of Christ and ICOC and all of Christendom. This is where you get, well, at what point are you exercising leadership? Can a woman lead a song? Could a woman lead a prayer without her husband? Could a woman share her testimony? Could a woman do the communion? Could she welcome by herself? Where's the line of teaching or exercising authority? And that's where you have to make a decision about that. But somewhere on that narrative, that's the largest point of limited participation. Full participation is folks that believe that men and women have, after the fall, after Jesus coming and creation, ushering in his new covenant, that according to Galatians 3, there is no male, there is no female, we are all equal. But they wouldn't point to that there's no two genders, obviously. What they would point to is back in Genesis 1 and 2, that Jesus came to reverse the curse. Jesus came to put things put things right. And that God's original intent, if you're looking for a narrative pattern, which is what most people that believe full participation looks like, if you're looking for a full pattern, the narrative of God's kingdom, according to this person who sees it this way, would be that when God says to Adam and Eve, to both of them, you are to take dominion over the entire earth. This is your place, both of you, to rule, and not differentiating those things. The fall affected men and women differently, but when Jesus came, he not only came to reverse that, but you also see him including women into his ministry, allowing Mary to sit at his feet, and many other examples that we don't have time to go into now, that women have now gotten to a place where in God's kingdom, through an entire narrative focus or an entire narrative experience, can fully participate in the worship service, that can do everything that a male can do. On the one side of no participation or limited participation, that's what is typically referred to as complementarianism, where men and women are equal, but they are not interchangeable. They complement each other. And on the other side, you would call probably the egalitarian perspective, which is that men and women are equal. And we take a look at all this, and we just want to give you an overview of this is what we're looking at, of these three kind of options of no participation, full participation, and limited participation. At some point, you got to make a decision. Those are pretty much all that there is. None, all, or some. And how we tend to approach Scripture can end up being the thing that provides a lot of the tension that different people have when looking at this topic and when making decisions about how we're going to put it into practice. And for you, probably good for you to reflect on what are you bringing to the table as far as reading Scripture, and then where have you come from, let's say, in contemplating the question about how women are to serve God in his church. And as we take a look at that, then we'll be able to engage with the Scripture, but also engage with ourselves, so that as we're discussing this topic, making decisions about this topic, that we're able to allow Jesus to still build our church in a way that is based in his word, and to be able to do and build in the way that he wants us to do. So that's a crash course in biblical interpretation and the three main perspectives of how women serve in God's church. Hope that's been helpful, and we'll see you on Saturday.